Think about the exact moment they decided to cross the line. In that microsecond, before the lie was spoken, before the action was taken, a subconscious calculation happened in their brain. We all do this. It's a behavioral forecasting mechanism. They looked at your history, they looked at your personality, and they ran a predictive model of how you would react. They thought they had you completely mapped out. They assumed you would cry or scream or beg or launch a chaotic revenge campaign that would ultimately make them look like the rational one to everyone else. They banked on your emotional collapse to justify what they were about to do. They factored in the cost of losing you, and in their flawed, arrogant assessment, they decided they could afford it. They thought you were a safe target. They thought your kindness was a symptom of weakness. But they made a fatal error in their profiling. They completely misread your baseline. They had absolutely no idea that you possess a psychological switch they have never seen before. They didn't realize that while they were playing a short-term game of ego and opportunism, they were about to trigger a chain reaction that would systematically dismantle their own life. They didn't know that your absence wouldn't just leave a hole in their routine. It would create a localized psychological vacuum that they cannot escape. Right now, they are walking around with a ticking time bomb in their subconscious, and the countdown started the moment they decided your loyalty was expendable. They thought they were cutting you down. They didn't realize they were cutting off their own life support. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what is happening inside their brain right now. You are going to learn the behavioral mechanics of why your silence is destroying them, how to weaponize their own guilt against them without lifting a finger, and why their decision to betray you will be the single most defining regret of their adult life. If you have ever been stabbed in the back by someone you trusted, do not click away. What I am about to show you is the ultimate blueprint for taking your power back, permanently. Welcome back. Let's dissect a dynamic that almost everyone misunderstands: the aftermath of a betrayal. When someone betrays you, your biological programming screams at you to react. The amygdala hijacks your brain. You want to confront them, expose them, demand closure, or burn their world to the ground. If you do that, you lose. If you give them a chaotic emotional reaction, you are handing them the exact data they need to validate their decision. You give them a narrative. They can point at your anger and say, "See, look how crazy they are. This is why I had to do it." But if you understand human behavior, you know that the most devastating thing you can do to a betrayer is deny them the reaction they budgeted for. If you stay with me through this breakdown, I am going to show you how to engineer a consequence so absolute it will alter their psychological baseline for years to come. We are going to strip away the emotion and look at the cold, hard mechanics of how a betrayer ruins their own life simply because you refuse to play the role they assigned to you. Let's look at what happens when you apply what we call the silent severance. When you find out what they did, you don't argue. You don't ask for an explanation. You simply observe the data, recognize they are a compromised variable, and you delete their access to you completely. To a narcissist, an opportunist, or a manipulator, attention is currency. Even negative attention is a payout. Absolute clinical indifference is bankruptcy. When you vanish without a word, you shatter their reality loop. Their brain cannot process the lack of friction. They expected a fight, but instead they stepped into thin air. This initiates a state of acute cognitive dissonance. They are left holding the smoking gun, standing in an empty room, with no one to blame but themselves. Over the next few weeks, you will see a predictable pattern of behavioral leakage. Because they cannot offload their guilt onto your reaction, the toxicity stays trapped inside their own system. It starts to manifest in their daily baseline. You'll notice, or others will notice, an increase in pacifying behaviors. They become hyper-defensive when unprovoked. They start over-explaining themselves to mutual contacts, trying to control a narrative that you aren't even participating in. Their sleep degrades. Their decision-making becomes erratic. They betrayed you to gain an advantage, a new partner, a professional step up, a momentary ego boost. but the human brain is wired for social cohesion. When they realize they threw away a high-value, loyal ally for a cheap, temporary thrill, the psychological interest on that debt begins to compound daily. Here is the final phase of their decline: your elevation. As they are scrambling to stabilize a life built on a foundation of disloyalty, you are reallocating the energy you used to spend on them into your own growth. You elevate, you build, you become untouchable. Because you didn't seek revenge, you remain a clean slate in their memory. You become a phantom consequence. Every time their new life falls short, every time their new friends betray them, every time their new partner lies to them, their brain will automatically reference the contrast. They will vividly remember the absolute security they had with you. They will realize that in their attempt to outsmart you, they played themselves. They traded gold for dirt, and they have to wake up every single day knowing that the architect of their misery was their own reflection in the mirror. They had no idea who they were dealing with, and by the time they figure it out, your door will be permanently locked. When we observe human interaction through a strictly clinical lens, the act of betrayal loses its emotional weight and reveals itself as a simple mechanical data point, a catastrophic failure in human profiling. The general population operates under the misconception that betrayal is rooted in deep-seated malice or a highly calculated desire to inflict suffering. It isn't. True malice requires far too many cognitive calories to maintain. Betrayal, in its most common and purest form, is driven by opportunistic convenience combined with a profound structural error in assessing the target. They did not betray you because they despised you. They betrayed you because their brain ran a subconscious behavioral algorithm and incorrectly concluded that the cost of your destruction was significantly lower than the immediate payout they stood to gain. Every human being is constantly engaging in subconscious baseline profiling. When they looked at you, they observed your kindness, your behavioral consistency, and your willingness to invest in the connection. But the untrained mind frequently misinterprets high-value traits. They looked at your empathy and systematically coded it in their mental ledger as a vulnerability. They observed your patience and logged it as an inherent lack of boundaries. They compiled a behavioral profile of you that was fundamentally flawed from the ground up, built entirely on the arrogant assumption that your predictability equated to powerlessness. They operated under the delusion that they were the apex variable in the dynamic, while you were merely a reliable, expendable resource. This is precisely where the behavioral miscalculation becomes toxic to their own psychological ecosystem. Before they ever executed the lie, their brain ran a predictive forecast of your response. They anticipated a specific, rigid sequence of events. You discovering the breach of trust, your subsequent emotional collapse, your desperate attempts to demand closure, or perhaps a chaotic, disorganized outburst of anger. They budgeted for your grief. They actively prepared for your outrage. They actually needed you to act erratically because your emotional dysregulation would serve as the necessary camouflage for their own guilt, allowing them to seamlessly flip the narrative and justify their actions to themselves and their surrounding social circle. They engineered their entire exit strategy around the absolute, unwavering certainty that you would shatter upon impact. What they failed to measure, what their flawed profiling tools could not possibly detect, was the hidden architecture of your psychological resilience. They only assessed the surface-level baseline you permitted them to see, but they never tested the bedrock. They had no conception of the mental framework you possess, the ability to instantly detach, clinically analyze the new data, and ruthlessly categorize them as a compromised variable. They fundamentally did not understand that a human being can be deeply compassionate while simultaneously possessing an absolute psychological kill switch. When they made their move, they expected the recoil to devastate you, completely unaware that your baseline is built to absorb the kinetic energy of their worst decisions without losing an ounce of structural integrity. Because of this colossal failure in their threat assessment, they are now operating in a reality they did not plan for and cannot control. They triggered an event expecting to easily manage a broken, desperate victim, but instead, they triggered a highly regulated, impassive observer who simply stepped back and watched them self-destruct. Every single assumption they made about your breaking point was a narcissistic delusion fabricated by their own inflated ego, leaving them completely unequipped and utterly exposed as they attempt to navigate the immediate psychological vacuum your sudden silence just created, while their own nervous system begins the terrifying process of realizing that their primary tactical advantage was a complete hallucination, and their own behavior is now the direct catalyst for their rapid social and psychological destabilization. To understand why your absence systematically dismantles their baseline, you have to look at the underlying biological currency of human interaction: validation and attention. We often look at betrayal as a physical event or an overt act of deception, but at its core, it is an exchange of psychological fuel. Manipulators, opportunists, and toxic personalities do not operate in a vacuum. Their entire sense of identity, dominance, and social equilibrium requires a steady external stream of emotional data. Your attention was the constant stabilizing force in their life, a continuous supply of psychological oxygen that kept their fragile ego from collapsing under the weight of its own inadequacies. When someone decides to betray you, their subconscious mind assumes that this emotional connection will remain partially intact, even if the dynamic turns hostile. In their internal framework, they believe that your anger, your tears, your desperate interrogations, and your attempts to make sense of their actions are guaranteed forms of investment. To the predatory or narcissistic brain, negative attention is still attention. It is still a transaction where you are spending your cognitive resources on them, thereby confirming their significance. They expect you to act as an emotional mirror, reflecting their importance back at them. They calculate that even if they destroy the connection, they will still occupy prime real estate inside your head, sustaining their psychological appetite through the chaos they created. The fatal tactical mistake they make is assuming the valve cannot be shut off instantly. When you identify the betrayal, step back, and enforce a state of absolute clinical detachment, you cut the supply line completely. You do not argue. You do not demand accountability. You do not send lengthy, emotionally charged paragraphs analyzing what went wrong. You abruptly and permanently sever every channel of emotional feedback. By refusing to engage, you starve their psychological ecosystem of the exact nutrient it requires to maintain its false sense of control. This sudden deprivation creates an acute behavioral vacuum that triggers an immediate alarm in their nervous system. Without your emotional reaction to absorb the impact of their betrayal, the kinetic energy of their own toxicity has nowhere to go. It turns inward. In an instant, the narrative they spent weeks constructing begins to implode. In the absence of a screaming, devastated target, there is no drama to distract them from their own reflection. There is no chaotic adversary to point to in order to justify their low-integrity actions to their peers. They are suddenly left suffocating in an empty room of their own making, gasping for an emotional response that is never going to come. Every silence from you acts as a non-verbal confirmation that they are completely irrelevant, fundamentally ordinary, and utterly stripped of any psychological leverage over your existence. This sudden lack of engagement forces their subconscious into a state of panic because they have built their entire survival strategy on the predictability of your reactions. When you deny them access to your cognitive energy, they lose the ability to regulate their own reality. They begin to realize that the elevated position they held was entirely artificial. It was funded, maintained, and subsidized by your generosity and focus. The moment you revoke that sponsorship, the illusion dissolves, leaving their fractured self-worth to crash down without a single word of confrontation from your side, as the cold reality settles in that they willingly choked out the only true source of stability they had. When we observe the timeline of a betrayal, the immediate aftermath is almost always characterized by a spike in artificial confidence, a temporary neurological high fueled by the illusion of superiority. In the initial hours and days following the act, the betrayer's brain is flooded with dopamine. They feel a sense of triumphant cunning, operating under the dangerous delusion that they have successfully manipulated the social matrix and bypassed the consequences of their actions. This is the peak of their arrogance, a fragile state of psychological elevation where they actually believe their own fabricated narrative. But the human brain is not designed to permanently compartmentalize an active breach of its own social survival instincts. As the initial dopamine response metabolizes, and your utter lack of a reaction begins to starve their ego, the internal architecture of their deception starts to buckle under its own immense cognitive load. This structural failure always presents itself first through behavioral leakage. Because they cannot process the cognitive dissonance of your silence, their limbic system registers a persistent, low-grade threat. You are not attacking them, which means they cannot defend themselves. You are simply gone, and that uncertainty becomes a virus in their central nervous system. The stress of maintaining the lie and managing the unexpected psychological fallout begins to bypass their conscious control, leaking out through uncontrollable physical and verbal tells. You will see a sudden increase in pacifying behaviors, excessive touching of the back of the neck, rubbing the face, or a sudden inability to maintain a relaxed baseline posture. Their sleep architecture fragments. Their blink rate increases rapidly during casual conversations. The toxic energy they generated to destroy you is now trapped inside their own physical body, slowly burning out their parasympathetic nervous system and forcing their brain into a perpetual state of hypervigilance. As this anxiety amplifies, it inevitably forces the betrayer into a desperate cycle of overcompensation. The internal collapse requires external masking, so they begin to heavily over-engineer their public persona. They become aggressively, artificially happy. They will post incessantly on social media platforms, broadcasting a highly curated, desperate illusion of success and unbothered peace. Verbally, this overcompensation manifests as unsolicited over-explaining. They will corner mutual acquaintances to voluntarily offer up convoluted justifications for why the connection ended, desperately trying to manipulate a narrative that no one even asked them to defend. This is the absolute hallmark of a guilty conscience drowning in its own anxiety. They are terrified of the silence you left behind, so they try to fill the void with their own frantic noise, entirely unaware that their excessive need to prove they are fine is the exact data point broadcasting their psychological ruin to everyone around them. This frantic attempt to maintain the facade ultimately triggers the final phase of their self-inflicted punishment: complete social destabilization. The human beings in their immediate periphery, even the untrained ones, possess a subconscious biological ability to detect behavioral incongruence. Their new friends, their new partners, or their professional colleagues begin to sense the erratic frequency vibrating underneath their forced smiles. The betrayer becomes a social liability, radiating an unstable energy that repels high-value individuals. As their newly constructed reality begins to fracture under the immense pressure of their unresolved guilt, they are forced to watch their immediate environment slowly turn against them, trapped in a deteriorating social ecosystem of their own design, acutely aware that the very foundation of their current existence is rotting from the inside out. When we analyze the mechanics of conflict, the untrained mind instinctively defaults to engagement. Biological programming dictates that when a threat presents itself, such as a profound betrayal of trust, The central nervous system demands immediate, forceful action to neutralize the perceived danger and reestablish equilibrium. This impulsive drive manifests as the desperate need to argue, to expose the perpetrator, to inflict proportional emotional damage, or to relentlessly pursue the elusive concept of closure. However, in the high-stakes theater of psychological dynamics, executing this biological default is a catastrophic tactical error. By giving the betrayer an emotional reaction, you are inadvertently handing them the exact operational intelligence they require to validate their actions. You transform yourself from a casualty of their poor character into an active, chaotic participant in a shared drama. Your anger, your grief, and your vocalized pain serve as a protective shield for their ego, providing them with a tangible, dysregulated target to point at and utilize as justification for their disloyalty. The tactical application of absolute detachment, conversely, is the most devastating behavioral weapon available in the human arsenal. We define this protocol as the silent severance. It is not the passive-aggressive silent treatment, nor is it a temporary timeout designed to punish them until they apologize. It is the immediate, surgical removal of your presence, your energy, and your emotional data from their reality. When you discover the betrayal, you must bypass the amygdala's demand for conflict and shift entirely into the executive function of the prefrontal cortex. You view the betrayer not as an enemy to be fought, but strictly as a deeply flawed variable that has just critically failed a behavioral stress test. Once the empirical data confirms they are compromised, you do not debate the results or demand an explanation. You simply initiate a total communication blackout. You close every avenue of access, block every digital and physical channel, and eradicate any possibility of them extracting further psychological resources from your ecosystem. This clinical silence is neurologically agonizing for the betrayer because it fundamentally violates the anticipated rules of social engagement. Manipulators and opportunists engineer their betrayals with the expectation of intense friction. They anticipate the collision. They have already rehearsed their defensive arguments, constructed their gaslighting narratives, and prepared their counterattacks based on the absolute assumption that you will strike back. When you execute the silent severance, you completely dismantle their operational framework by removing the battlefield entirely. They throw a punch into a void, and the momentum of their own toxicity violently pulls them off balance. The human brain is exceptionally poor at processing a complete lack of feedback, particularly when it is primed for conflict. Without your reaction to anchor their fabricated narrative, their limbic system begins to short-circuit. They are denied the emotional friction required to metabolize their guilt, leaving them stranded in a terrifying psychological vacuum. By strictly withholding your response, you assert the ultimate form of psychological dominance, communicating with absolute, undeniable clarity that their actions did not destroy you, but rather their actions simply rendered them entirely irrelevant to your existence. You permanently strip them of their power to influence your emotional state, proving that they were never the apex variable in the dynamic, but merely an expendable participant who severely overestimated their own value, forcing their brain to confront the terrifying truth that you were always the one holding the leverage. And by choosing silence, you have permanently locked them in a psychological prison of their own making. The final stage of this psychological dismantling does not require any active operational input from you, because the architecture of their punishment is constructed entirely within the isolated confines of their own memory. When you execute absolute detachment and reallocate your cognitive resources exclusively toward your own structural elevation, you become what we define in behavioral analysis as a phantom consequence. By ruthlessly refusing to engage in the chaotic emotional fallout they actively budgeted for, You remain an untarnished, unbothered variable in their mental landscape. You did not degrade your baseline by fighting them in the mud. You simply transcended their operational frequency. As they are left behind to manually manage the exhausting, high-friction reality they engineered through their own disloyalty, your upward trajectory continues unimpeded, establishing a permanent and devastating comparative contrast in their subconscious. They are forced to passively observe from a distance as you systematically optimize your life, operating completely unaffected by the sabotage they confidently assumed would permanently dismantle you. The human brain heavily relies on comparative data analysis to assess its own social standing and internal stability. And because they intrinsically tied their ego to your anticipated destruction, your ongoing success becomes a daily, involuntary, biological trigger. Every time their new social ecosystem fails them, every time a shallow connection fractures under pressure, or their manipulative tactics inevitably backfire, their limbic system will automatically reference the baseline of absolute security and loyalty they previously shared with you. In their mind, the image of your continued elevation isn't a fading, degraded memory. It is a meticulously composed scene, rendered in their subconscious with the absolute clarity of a 2D hand-drawn illustration. The psychological stability you represent haunts them in vivid detail, washing over their intrusive thoughts like a watercolor masterpiece painted in a grounding, warm mud-earth palette, perfectly depicting the untouchable peace they willingly forfeited. They are forced to vividly visualize this aesthetic of success that you are currently embodying, agonizing over every single frame of your progress, recognizing with terrifying clarity that they deliberately authored their own removal from your long-form narrative. This phantom consequence acts as an inescapable psychological anchor, violently dragging their conscious awareness back to the exact microsecond they decided your loyalty was an expendable resource. They begin to forensically examine their own flawed decision-making matrix, arriving at the horrifying realization that the temporary dopamine spike of their betrayal was the literal catalyst for their current trajectory of decline. They traded a high-value, structurally sound alliance for a fleeting, low-yield opportunity, and the compound interest of that catastrophic investment is now actively bankrupting their emotional reserves. Your absolute silence and your relentless success operate in perfect tandem as an unbreakable feedback loop, continuously broadcasting the irrefutable empirical data that they did not outsmart you. They merely disqualified themselves from your future. They find themselves permanently trapped in a self-inflicted psychological quarantine where the walls are constructed entirely of their own unresolvable regrets. Fully aware that the hostile energy they spent trying to break your foundation was the exact kinetic mechanism you weaponized to launch yourself forward. As they attempt to navigate the deteriorating wreckage of their compromised baseline, the phantom of your unbothered elevation silently stalks every new connection they desperately try to build, constantly reinforcing the cold, clinical truth that they destroyed the most valuable asset they had for absolutely zero return on investment. They are forced to wake up every single morning and stare into the mirror, carrying the crushing, inescapable weight of knowing that the sole architect of their profound, ongoing misery was their own arrogant miscalculation, realizing entirely too late that while they were busy playing a pathetic, short-sighted game of ego and opportunism, you were simply observing their failure, clinically gathering the data, and using their betrayal as the raw fuel to construct an unassailable reality they will never, under any circumstances, be permitted to access or disrupt again.